Hello everyone, my name is Mr. Gentleman and this is Gentlemanly Inquiry, where once a month I answer, respond, and even sometimes rant for my patrons' questions. If you are a patron at any level, for now at least, you may field a question I will attempt to give my in-depth opinion on. And if you are a patron at the Baron level, you can even go for two. Before we begin, I quickly want to thank the person who sent in a donation via PayPal. Thank you, I am quite grateful. The game that serves as the background imagery of today's video is Super Robot Wars T for the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. First off, I apologize for this being so late. It has been quite hectic recently, but I am going to try to get this out every 30 days with whatever questions you send. My solution to that is to basically turn this into a live stream, and unlike my gaming streams, I'll leave this up on the channel for everyone to see. Anyway, on to the patron questions. I would like to answer a long-running question I often see in the comments. Why haven't I done any Jrpgs? The reason for a long time was simple. My computer back then could not handle both playing a game and recording one. In fact, I tried and the footage ended up very choppy. As a result, it simply wasn't feasible in any way. My current computer, however, can handle it. However, right now I am very invested in clearing up whatever NES and early Game Boy games I want to cover, while also beginning to dig into the 16-bit era. So the time for covering early Jrpgs may come eventually, but not yet, unfortunately. Anyway, on to the patron questions. The first is from Mark McCarty, a patron at the Baron level. Thank you, Mark, a long-time subscriber. His first question is, what do you think is a great game for getting people interested in the RPG genre, especially casual gamers or non-gamers? This is always a little bit of a difficult question because it really depends on the person and their tastes. If they're willing to get into a top-down RPG, then I'll always say Dragon Quest IV is a great entry point. The only issue or benefit, depending on the person, is that the mobile version is recommended due to it being the most complete version, especially with the party chat, which adds so much more in terms of character dynamics. But the reason I say 4 is because it has really inviting characters. The chapter system is really engaging because it keeps the story going, and it gets you into RPG mechanics very quickly. Another may be some version of Final Fantasy IV, because it has a really compelling protagonist. The ATB system isn't too fast in that version, so it's not hard to figure out. If they want a modern RPG and a 3D game, there are a few options. If they are willing to get into action RPGs, or they were into action games to begin with, then Ys 8 is a really excellent entry point. The thing about Ys games is that they are very addicting, and they have difficulty levels that accommodate pretty much everyone. It can be baby's first action RPG, or Dark Souls depending on what you choose. And if they enjoy it, they'll probably ask for more games like it. And you could then probably recommend another Ys game, or another action RPG like one of the Tales of series, or perhaps they would be open by that point to a turn-based RPG. Overall, I would ask the person what they would be interested in playing, and if possible, let them try some demos. Dragon Quest XI's is a pretty easy RPG if they want to try a modern 3D game, and the great thing about it is that it has a 10-hour demo. I think how they feel after that would be a good indicator as to whether or not they want to get into the genre or not. Mark's second question is, if I could ask another multi-part question, it would be, where do you draw the line on RPG and or JRPG genre? Are genres good for categorization, or do they make things more complicated due to arguments? Or maybe both of these are true. This is a question I actually want to make a video about eventually. But to be short, RPGs in my opinion contain a character or characters who are defined by stats or skills which can be upgraded in some form over time. usually by a leveling system or character building system, or both. And this last part is important. These systems must be necessary to completing the game, in that without the leveling system or RPG mechanics, you cannot complete the game. Put simply, if you remove the leveling system from any Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, there is no way you could complete the game. Your stats would be stuck at level 1. It would be impossible. To give an example of something that has RPG elements but it's not an RPG, Danganronpa 2 has a leveling system, but all it allows you to do is equip more skills that are not necessary to complete the game. They may make it a little easier, but it's not absolutely integral to all of the gameplay. Splinter Cell Blacklist is another example. There is an upgrade system and it does help, but its impact on the stealth is not so huge that it's impossible to play the game without it. Compare all of this to Deus Ex, where if you don't have a single upgrade in your gun skill, it is pretty much impossible to use a character who can use guns well. Or for a JRPG, in Final Fantasy V, if you get a character to Black Mage level 1, and then switch to another class, and use Black Mage as your subclass, it's not going to do much for you eventually. I hope that answers the first part of the question well enough. I also do believe that there is such a thing as something being more RPG than something else, but that's getting really deep into the subject. As for JRPG and genre, that is where it gets really complicated, because the problem is that the history of the word JRPG is extremely shaky. With platformer or sports game or puzzle game, while those are broad genres, they are well defined and agreed upon, and have been for decades. And with subgenres such as first-person cover shooter or Metroidvania, the concepts as to what make those up are well agreed upon. The problem is that what makes up a JRPG has never, ever been historically agreed upon. In fact, and I will explain this in my JRPG video whenever I do it, but the term JRPG kind of came out of nowhere and people accepted it. The fact that people argue over what should be or should not be considered a JRPG, should strategy RPGs count or not, should first-person dungeon crawlers be counted or not, it's all such a chaotic affair. And it's what I consider the result of being given an artificial term. It was thrown at us, we accepted it, and didn't realize the chaos that would result from that. The fact that the topic comes up on r/JRPG at least once a month alone proves that no one can really agree upon what it means. I personally think that genre labels are useful, whether they be as broad as shooter or as specific as first-person arcade-style shooter. I just think the terms JRPG and even WRPG are extremely unreliable labels. I personally use the term JRPG as more of a regional style than a genre label. Joseph Patrick Pascal, a patron at the Gentleman at Arms level, asks, Final Fantasy VII Remake is on a lot of our minds right now. This is a game we waited forever for. Honestly, I didn't think it was going to happen. I thought things like Advent Children were because they didn't think they could live up to the hype of the original. And after FF7R being announced, it seemed like it was in development hell. However, now it's here, and it's more of an action game than a traditional console-style RPG. Original Final Fantasy VII was the game that brought the genre into the mainstream outside of Japan. Considering the historical perspective, what does FF7R being so action-focused say about the legacy and the future of the genre? Using an action style rather than console-style RPG says a lot more about Square than it does the genre as a whole. Here is something you all need to know. Square's primary players have a very inner circle kind of culture, and they basically do whatever they want, whenever they want. Or at least they used to. They finally cracked down on Nomura. Square has 12 main development groups. 1 through 4 work on Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts. and these 4 are basically run by this inner circle. And the people within this group, they lie every now and then. They are willing to lie when they need to. Yoshinori Kitase, who was the original director of Final Fantasy VII, 8, and was the head producer on 10 and the 13 trilogy, had said that Final Fantasy would have been an action RPG series back in the day if they had the ability to do it. That is total and complete nonsense. Square was already making action RPGs back then. They were making party-based action RPGs back then. But Kitase lies because he wants to push his inner circle's agenda. And their agenda, if I had to boil it down, is that all of their RPGs must be action games with at least a little Kingdom Hearts influence within them all. And if you look at Square's history over the past 20 years, you can see that there is a pattern that proves this to be true. Kitase attempts to revise history in order to make the current agenda sound good. And I theorize that for a long time, they had the Square's board of directors fooled as well. The board was shocked. Their response was, wait, people still like turn-based RPGs? It was a revelation for them. So I don't think it says much about the genre as a whole. What it does say is that Square Development Groups 1 through 4 are going to make nothing but action RPGs forever. Or at least until Kitase and Nomura lose influence. There are still plenty of other turn-based RPGs out there, including ones made by Square Development Groups 5 through 12. In fact, the biggest plot twist in reality is that Yakuza 7 is a turn-based RPG. No one expected it, but here we are. And I really hope the Western release comes very soon now that I mention it. Doug Bailey, a patron on the Baron level, asks, looks like there's really no getting around talking about FF7R this month. The interest in your take on the ending and the entire approach to it as a remake in general go without saying. So I'll shoot for a more specific but adjacent question. Before I get to your true question, Doug, I may as well answer this part first. I am actually more fascinated with the culture's view of FF7R than I am with my own. That might come from the fact that I have never been in love with the game as a whole. That might come from the fact I've never been in love with the game myself. I understand the argument that a remake is not the original. It is its own thing, the original will always be there, and as a result the remake can be a different game. Different remakes are made for different reasons. Sometimes a remake is made without any expectation. And even then, some people get pissed off when those ones aren't completely faithful. Sometimes, a remake is made because somebody wants that exact game remade with a few extras. Dragon Quest 4, 5, and 6 are nice because they are very faithful, and whatever new was added already complements what was there. With Final Fantasy VII, people wanted a remake just like that. Similar story and gameplay, with some expansion on them, but in a better up-to-date format. And if I was in their position, I would be angry too. If, say, Dragon Quest V suddenly had a change to its... Oh, I'm opening that can of worms up again, aren't I? Well, let's just say that if they made a new game version of 5, and they suddenly decided to change the last third of the game, I would be pretty pissed off. The ending itself also does not feel Final Fantasy at all. It feels very Kingdom Hearts. And as someone who is interested in writing, that annoys me. It feels as if Nomura just injected himself into that ending. And I do not like that Sephiroth feels overexposed now. The fear factor he had in the original just feels like it's gone now. Now on to your true question. I'm a big fan of overworld maps. There seems to be a widespread stigma against their inclusion in modern RPGs. There seems to be a widespread stigma against their inclusion in modern RPGs now that games like Breath of the Wild and 1,000 others have been able to create huge, seamless, life-sized environments. The practice of shrinking the world down and having some big, cartoonish representation of your protagonist stomping around a top-scale model of the game's world feels like a bit of an outdated tool to solve a problem that no longer exists. But it still has been employed by modernish games like Ni no Kuni and Bravely Default. Do you think this classic RPG staple has a place in the likes of FF7R and other games? I feel like we're still in an awkward period where there are serious compromises made with its omission. We are certainly capable of rendering a huge in-game area to full scale now. For example, a whole continent. But a whole planet? Map-based fast travel and loading screens just don't feel like suitable replacements to me. Firstly, I'm going to use the term abstracted map, because that's what I call it. The map is abstracted to look like you are traveling across an entire country. Secondly, have you played Saga Scarlet Grace? Very difficult game, but in terms of how much land you cover, it is a gigantic abstracted map. It is separated by various areas, but there is so much land to cover. By the end of the game, it feels as if you have traversed an entire continent. I really love that game, and it really pushes you to master the combat. So do I think this still has a place in modern games? And do I think that a full 3D world still has its limitations? The answer is yes and yes. The way I look at it is this. You can either take your money and create the best of what you were already doing, or you can make something new with more limitations. A lot of 3D RPGs tend to have linear, limited paths from one area to another, and it is noticeable in certain games. Even the higher budget open world AAA Western RPGs tend to only be able to cover a specific region, whereas for the same budget, not only could you make an abstracted map of the entire planet, but now you could probably make one that surpasses every one we have seen from previous generations. You can make one that is more detailed and interactive with more locations than before. It can even be said to be a missed opportunity. For example, imagine a game where you had the world interactivity of Breath of Fire's maps, where you could fish, hunt animals, have certain characters who could only traverse through certain areas, or have locations you can see but you can't access for now, as only characters you gain later can unlock them in Metroidvania fashion. Or rather than characters, perhaps the vehicles you gather throughout the game can give you more and more access to the map, kind of like the first Phantasy Star. You could add a ton of unique mini locations, all that trigger mini side stories like Saga Scarlet Grace. And you could have a ton of side locations with their own stories and cultures and whatnot, kind of bringing in that exploratory feeling from Dragon Quest III. In general, you could take a 2D top-down map and make it much denser than all the ones we've seen before. The point is, I think that rather than using the technology for graphics, you could combine the best ideas from yesterday's RPGs into the best version of what they can be. Trent Gleason, a gentleman at arms, asks, where do you find all of your research regarding developer history? I feel like a lot of that stuff must be buried in untranslated Japanese magazines or TV spots. I have 3 primary answers to that, some surprising and some unsurprising. One is Shmuplations. Shmuplations is a great resource for old interviews that have been translated. Shmuplations is a great resource for old interviews that have been translated. Probably the best Western resource. There are interviews with Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura about Dragon Quest 2, 3, and 4, all of which were packed with information. I highly suggest that site. My second resource are the citations on Wikipedia. Now there are people who do get nervous at the mention of Wikipedia, and they will tell you that it's not a reliable resource. However, the best articles have citations. Click on them, and at the bottom are the sources. And those usually lead to an interview or resource document that is reliable. So what you can do is go to the page of that game and just check those sources. Or you can even read the wiki article itself. As long as these sources have legitimate origins, then it is good for use. My third answer is that it never hurts to do a YouTube search. I randomly did a search for something related to Phantasy Star 3, and I came across an interview. I wasn't even looking for it, but it found me, or no. And sometimes, I simply look for something and I find it. All of that footage from the day that Dragon Quest III released, I YouTube searched it. So at the end of the day, ask and thou shalt receive. Daniel Alberto Vasquez Rodriguez, a patron at the nobleman level, asks, "Hello, I hope you are doing well. I am. Thank you very much. Why do you think there is a lot of problems bringing JRPGs to the West? We see they are popular and people demand it. We see they are popular and people have a demand for them, but sometimes we have to wait even years to see those games in the West." Well, there are a few problems. One is whether or not the Western company finds the translation to be worth it. Translating a game can take a lot of time. It costs a lot of money, which is on top of the cost of licensing the game itself. So the company has to be sure that the profits on the money they will make back will exceed what they spent. And as certain games now include more and more dialogue than ever, this can be a huge hurdle. The Legend of Heroes or Trails games are excellent examples of this. Another issue is that while yes, JRPGs are in demand, not every JRPG is the same, and not every one appeals to everybody in the community. So it can be an uphill battle convincing people in the West that they have an interest in that particular game. But the main issue is that while the JRPG fanbase has grown, it is still ultimately a niche culture, and companies understandably would very much prefer these games sold to and appealed to more people. In my opinion, the biggest issue is with advertising. Western companies have no idea how to advertise JRPGs to the West. They have been completely lost on this for 20 years now. If they ever could overcome that problem, then JRPGs would be way more popular. A great example is the Yakuza franchise. For years people had this perception that it was the Japanese Grand Theft Auto. Nothing could be further from the truth. And it took a long time for word of mouth to finally get the series popular. So while yes, JRPGs are more well known, there are still huge hurdles to overcome. Simon Park, a nobleman, asks, "Just want to know the schedule of releases. But no big deal, I like getting surprised too. Do you mean when I release during a month or what the future holds?" I'll answer both. I try, emphasis on try, to release during the 3rd or 4th of the month. And the current schedule right now looks approximately as follows. Final Fantasy IV will be out very soon, then most likely Saga 1, but that is up in the air, then Dragon Quest V, then Saga 2 or Saga 1 if I haven't released it yet, Fire Emblem is down the road, then maybe some small videos about Langrisser 1 and Shining in the Darkness, Romancing Saga for sure, and then Phantasy Star 4. Probably a smaller video after that, and then Final Fantasy V. Basically, my goal for the rest of the year is to finish up the Saga and Fire Emblem games, while also doing the big 16-bit titles from 1991 and then 1992. Those 2 years were huge for RPGs. So much that was important were created over the course of a year. I'm also considering doing a side video called Dragon Quest Clones, just to cover those NES games within one video. Though again, all of this is subject to change. I may throw in some curveballs down the road, such as many NES games you were perhaps not expecting. I suppose I will say this. I do have a script for Crystallis lying around. When will I get to it? I don't know. It all depends. We shall see. Anyway, that was very fun. Submissions are now open for next month's video, so if you are a patron, go ahead and shoot me a long-form question. Again, if you are a Baron, you get 2. All you have to do is message me over Patreon if you are a patron. If you wish to support me and partake in this for as low as $1 a month, you may go over there and do so. For those who have not subscribed yet, I ask that you do so. Thank you for watching, and God bless you all.